Roy Tanner wasn't the kind of man you noticed in a crowd. He didn't carry himself like a legend, didn't dress the part of a hero. Most folks on Oakwood Drive knew him as the guy who could get your lawnmower purring again, or make sense of an old V8 that refused to turn over. He was 6'0", with a back that no longer stood quite straight, and hands thick with calluses that spoke of a lifetime coaxing life back into dead machines. Most weekends, Roy's garage door hung open like a friendly smile, the kind that said, "Come on in, neighbor, what seems to be the trouble?" Inside, there'd be the sound of wrenches clinking, rock and roll from a dusty radio in the corner. Lynyrd Skynyrd or Creedence Clearwater Revival, always analog, never digital. And Roy, in a flannel shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbow, wiping oil off his hands as he welcomed you in. He was 68. Didn't look it, not really. Time had greyed his hair and stiffened his joints, sure, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that hadn't dulled with age, a kind of stillness that came from having already faced every kind of chaos, a calm that couldn't be bought, borrowed, or faked. The neighbors saw what they wanted to see, the gentle old man with a socket set and a coffee thermos. The truth was buried deep, beneath 30 years of government silence, beneath a dozen assumed names and hundreds of missions that never officially existed. Roy Tanner had once been the man they sent in when every other option had failed. He was Delta Force before they called it Delta. A ghost. A man whose name came up in whispers, if it came up at all, and he liked it that way. He'd earned every scar, every quiet night, every hour spent under a car hood instead of under fire. He didn't want to be remembered for the things he'd done. He wanted to be remembered for the things he could still fix. Only one person on this earth knew all of it. Every chapter, every wound, every loss, too classified to be mourned in public. Her name was Linda. They'd been married 43 years. She was the only one who'd stayed when the deployment stretched into months, when the nightmares pulled him screaming from sleep, when he came home not just broken, but rebuilt into someone else entirely. Linda had held him through all of it, through the silences that lasted days, through the moments he forgot where he was, who he was. She never flinched, never left. She saw something in Roy that even Roy hadn't always seen in himself, a man worth saving. That Wednesday started like any other. Roy was under Mrs. Henderson's Buick, muttering to himself about a stripped oil plug. His shoulders ached from the awkward angle, but he was humming along with the radio and feeling good about the weather. First cool snap of September, like the world was finally remembering how to breathe again. Linda had gone to Palmer's Market for groceries. Senior, a discount day. She always said it like it was a secret she was proud to have earned. Roy liked the quiet. He liked the rhythm of oil dripping into a pan, the scent of engine grease in his nose, the sound of his wife's voice still echoing faintly in the morning air. Then came the screech. Not tires slowing, not kids playing. No, this was different. Sharp, urgent, intentional. Roy rolled out from under the car just as the black SUV nosed into his driveway. Matte black, no plates, tinted windows, 3 more followed. Tight formation, all slamming to a stop like they meant business. And they did. Doors flew open, boots hit concrete, shouts filled the air. "Police, everyone on the ground now!" Roy stood up slow, hands visible, palms open, grease still fresh on his skin. "There's been some kind of mistake," he said, voice calm. A rifle barrel gestured him to silence. "Down, now." He didn't resist, just lowered himself to the ground. Concrete met cheek, knees groaned. The scent of wet leaves mixed with motor oil. He didn't ask questions, didn't argue. That came later. Zip ties burned into his wrists. The weight of armored men surrounded him, radios crackled, commands flew. "Secure the house, back perimeter sweep. Suspect may be armed." Then, Linda. He heard the familiar rumble of her sedan before he saw it. Her voice floated over the chaos. Confused and afraid. "Roy, what's happening?" He turned his head just enough to see her. Grocery bags in her arms, apples and eggs, half a gallon of milk, her eyes wide with fear. "Drop the bags," someone shouted. "She's not a threat," Roy tried to say, but the boot pressed harder. "Hands where we can see them." Linda froze, confused, afraid. Her hands moved slowly, too slowly. "Non-compliant subject," an officer barked. Roy knew that voice. Young, too young to be holding a taser. voice trembling with adrenaline he hadn't earned. "Step back, old man, or you're next." And then it happened. The crackle of the taser. Linda's body convulsed. The bags fell, eggs shattering, apples rolling beneath combat boots, milk painting. The driveway white. She hit the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. And Roy? Roy didn't panic, didn't scream, didn't fight. Because Roy Tanner hadn't survived 27 years in the shadows by reacting first. He'd survived by calculating, by knowing exactly when to act, and when words were sharper than blades. He looked up at the officer with the command insignia and spoke 5 words. "Call General Raw right now." The effect was immediate. It was like someone had unplugged the moment everything froze. The radio static dimmed. Even the rifles lowered by a fraction. The commander blinked. "Call who?" Roy stared straight into the man's eyes. "You heard me. General James Rurik, Central Command, call him now." The young officer laughed. "Old man, we're executing a federal warrant. This is about Carlos Mendez, high-level trafficker. Save the military name-dropping." But Roy didn't blink, didn't flinch. "You're at 4588 Oakwood Drive," he said flatly. "You wanted 4588 Oakwood Avenue. Different zip code, different house. Now call the general." A beat passed, then another. The commander gave a nod. "Check the address," he said. And that, right there, was the moment the world started unraveling for them. They didn't know it yet. But Roy did, because Roy Tanner didn't need to yell to make himself heard. He just needed 5 words. They took Linda in the ambulance, even though Roy told them she'd be fine. He'd seen men take worse and walk again. But Linda wasn't a soldier, never had been. Her body didn't know how to fold around trauma the way his did. She was trembling when they loaded her in, still shocked, skin pale under the oxygen mask. Roy wasn't allowed to ride with her. He sat in the back of a police SUV, hands finally freed, though the ache from the zip ties still burned. The commanding officer, name tag read Carlisle, sat beside him, quiet, eyes forward. They'd confirmed the address mistake 30 minutes after the breach. Wrong house, wrong suspect. Everything wrong. "You got a hell of a nerve," Roy finally said, voice low. "Showing up like that. My wife's got a pacemaker." Carlisle winced. "I didn't know." Roy turned his head slowly. "The way old wolves do when deciding whether to bite. That's the problem. None of you knew a damn thing." The silence stretched. Only the hum of the idling engine and the occasional squawk from the radio filled. Carlisle cleared his throat. "I didn't know you were who you are." Roy didn't answer. He didn't need to. The call to General Rurik had done the work for him. Within minutes, the air had shifted. Cell phones rang in trembling hands. A man in black had stepped aside to take a private call, then returned with his jaw clenched and sweat beading on his brow. "Release him, now." No apology, no explanation, just quiet terror at the mistake they'd made. Roy had seen it before, in the eyes of young captains realizing they'd kicked the wrong door in a Kandahar slum. In the posture of politicians briefed too late on who exactly they'd just pissed off. "You were in Fallujah?" Carlisle asked after a pause, trying to fill the silence with something human. Roy glanced at him. "Which time?" Carlisle shut. "Up after that." By the time Roy arrived at the hospital, Linda was stable. They'd sedated her, ran a battery of tests. Her heart was okay. But her spirit was rattled. He sat by her bed, holding her hand, thumb brushing lightly across the knuckles. She always had cold hands, but now they were cold in a different way. A way that made him feel something he hadn't felt since the jungle. Helpless. The nurse tried to usher him out at midnight, but he didn't budge. Just looked at her with the same expressionless stare he'd once used on Afghan warlords and Cuban interrogators. She left him alone after that. Linda woke around 2 a.m., blinking, slowly, eyes trying to focus. "Hey, baby," he whispered. "You're okay," she swallowed. "They shot me." "No, just a taser. Dumb kid. Got scared." She chuckled weakly. "Well, I guess I can cross getting tased on my front lawn off the bucket list." Roy smiled, but only with his mouth. "I'm sorry," he said. "The words didn't come easy." "I should have—" "Don't," she interrupted. "You couldn't have known." But he could have. He should have. He'd seen too many operations like that. The nerves, the tempo. The way rookies were handed too much authority. with too little understanding. He should have spotted the signs sooner, should have gotten her out of harm's way. She squeezed his hand, reading him like she always did. I'm okay, Roy. But maybe it's time. Time for what? For people to remember who you are. Roy looked away, out the window into the dark. I don't want to go back there. I'm not saying you should, but maybe, just maybe, the world still needs you. He spent the next day cleaning up. Milk curdled in the cracks of the driveway. Apples bruised brown in the sun. One of the eggs had dried onto the concrete like some ugly Rorschach stain. The FBI sent someone in a suit, young, polite, carrying a tablet and an apology rehearsed in front of a mirror. There's going to be an internal investigation, the agent said, voice thin with bureaucratic guilt. What happened to you? And your wife? It was unacceptable. Roy said nothing. We can provide temporary housing if your wife. Roy shook his head. This is my home. The agent hesitated, then tapped his screen. If you'd be willing to sign a non-disclosure agreement. No. I'm sorry. I said no. You want me to stay quiet? You go back and tell your bosses they kicked down the wrong door, tased a 70-year-old woman, and pointed rifles at a retired special operations commander. See how quiet that stays? The agent stood there, mouth open like he'd forgotten the next line. Roy leaned forward. You tell them Roy Tanner doesn't vanish anymore. You got me. The kid left in a hurry. That night, Roy pulled down a box from the garage shelf. It was old, taped a dozen times, marked with a Sharpie that had faded to grey. Tools, keep. Inside weren't tools, there were patches, medals, photos so classified they'd been stamped with red ink warnings, a blood-stained map of Mosul, a snapped-off detonator from a mission that never made the books, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, his sidearm. Roy stared at it for a long time before unwrapping it. The metal gleamed dully in the low light. It felt heavier than he remembered, like it had waited too long to be held again. He didn't load it, just held it. There were men out there who thought they ran the world now, who kicked doors down without knowing who lived behind them, who never learned the old rules, never earned their place, and there were good people getting caught in the crossfire. He'd stayed silent for a long time. Let the world move on. Let the war stories fade. But maybe Linda was right. Maybe the world needed reminding. Roy Tanner wasn't just the man who fixed engines. He was the man who ended wars before they started. The first time Roy saw the black SUV, he was elbow-deep in motor oil, working on the old John Deere that hadn't run since the Obama administration. He didn't stop wrenching when it pulled up. Didn't even glance over. He knew the sound. Government tires had a certain arrogance to them, quiet, heavy, full of the kind of confidence only agencies and mercenaries wore. He listened to the hum of the engine, the click of the transmission, shifting into park, the pause before the door opened. 4 seconds. Someone was debating getting out. That meant respect or fear. Roy wiped his hands on an old rag, slow and deliberate. Then he turned. The man who stepped out wasn't in a suit. He wore a faded leather jacket, desert boots, jeans too crisp to be honest. His beard was trimmed close, military style, and his eyes carried the heavy weight of someone who'd watched. Men bleed out on foreign dirt. Roy squinted. The sunlight cut across the man's face. Then he recognized him. Alex Mason, Roy said, dry as dust. Well, I'll be damned. Thought you were dead. Mason grinned. That makes 2 of us. They didn't hug, they didn't shake hands. Men like them didn't need to. They just nodded. The kind of nod that carried years of blood, betrayal, and brotherhood. You still fixing tractors? Mason asked, glancing at the half-gutted Deere. You still working for people who don't exist? Mason chuckled. Touché. Roy leaned back against the tool bench, arms crossed. What do you want, Alex? Mason looked around the property. Birds chirped in the trees. Wind stirred the tall grass. It was peaceful here, the kind of place that made a man forget he'd once been a ghost. Then Mason said the thing that made Roy's chest tighten. They found Salgado. Roy didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. You sure? Mason nodded. Positive. Intel came in 3 days ago. He's in Sonora, running ops through a shell cartel called Los Hijos del Viento. But it's him. Same limp, same tactics, same signature. Roy's jaw clenched. He's supposed to be dead. He was. We buried that intel with 20 pounds of C4 and 2 operatives, but he slipped through. Like a roach. Roy turned. Away. Walked to the sink. Washed his hands slowly. Salgado, Colonel Diego Salgado. A name Roy hadn't heard in over a decade. A name that used to haunt dreams and mission briefings. A sadist with a genius for insurgency. The kind of warlord who didn't just break rules, he rewrote them in blood. Roy had put a bullet in his shoulder in Marja, left him in a burning compound surrounded by friendlies, but now he was back, and if Mason was here, it wasn't just to share old ghosts. You didn't come to warn me, Roy said. How you came to ask me? Mason didn't answer. You want me back, Roy continued. You want the boogeyman, the one who ran Black Ops with nothing but a blade and a radio. He turned slowly. I told you. I'm out. Mason nodded. Yeah. I figured you'd say that. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, tossed it onto the bench. Roy didn't touch it, just stared at it. What's in there? Your farm. The attack. The mistake from the agency. The fingerprints? They didn't come from just some dumb kids playing gangster. Roy narrowed his eyes. It was a soft probe, Mason said. They were paid. Set up. Someone wanted to see who lived here. What you'd do. What kind of response you'd trigger. Who? Mason looked him dead in the eye. Salgado. The silence that followed was cold and tight, like a noose slipping around the throat. He knows I'm alive? Mason nodded. Not just that. He wants you. Personally. Wants to finish what he started. Roy said nothing. Just reached over and picked up the envelope. Inside were photos, surveillance shots of Roy's property, zoomed-in images of Linda leaving the grocery store, a snapshot of their mailbox half buried in snow, then the last one, a thermal scan taken from a drone. Roy's face turned to stone. He's watching, Mason said. And he's coming. They sat at the kitchen table that night. Roy, Linda, and the envelope between them. She held a cup of tea in both hands, but it had gone cold. You think it's true? She asked quietly. Roy nodded. Yeah. She looked at the window out into the dark. Then we need to decide. I've already decided, Roy said. Linda turned to him. No, Roy. We decide. You go after this man. We both go to war. Again. And we already buried too much of our lives in sand and silence. Roy stared at the grain of the wood table. There were scars on it. Burns, dents, marks from dinners long gone. A life built piece by piece. I never wanted to go back, he said. But if I don't end this now, he'll bring it to us. Linda reached out, touched his hand, then promised me one thing. What? That you'll come back. This time, come back whole. Roy met her eyes. And for a moment, all the layers of the killer, the commander, the legend, they peeled away. He was just a man, trying to protect the only thing he ever loved. I'll come back, he whispered. I swear it. And in that moment, the mission began. 200 miles south of the border, deep in the Sonoran wasteland where even the buzzards flew higher out of fear, a convoy of armored pickups crawled down a red dirt road. Dust devils spun in their wake, and the sun hung low, hot and vengeful, like it had a grudge against every man below. They called themselves Los Hijos del Diablo, the devil's sons. But they weren't born from myth or desert folklore. They were born from blood, vengeance, and an American-trained monster named Colonel Diego Salgado. And today they had a guest. He was cuffed, beaten, shirtless, and bleeding from the mouth. Knees trembling, stumbling as he was dragged toward the hacienda that rose like a warlord's castle from the sand. Concrete, steel, solar towers, military-grade fencing. This was no cartel safe house. This was a fortress. Salgado stood on the balcony, watching the man being brought in. He wore all black, simple and functional, combat boots, cargo pants, a shirt stretched tight over a chest that hadn't softened with age. His hair had gone silver at the temples, but his eyes burned cold, like a cobra watching a mouse that didn't know it was already dead. The prisoner was thrown to the floor. His name was Camilo Reyes, a smuggler, a runner, a whisperer of secrets. More importantly, he'd recently accepted a handful of American dollars to help track down a farmer in Wyoming, a farmer who moved like death in the dark. "Señor Reyes," Salgado said, voice like broken gravel. "You have seen him?" Reyes, coughed blood, nodded weakly. "Yes, he's alive." Salgado smiled. "Roy Tanner." It wasn't a question. It was a memory, hot, sharp, and soaked in fury. "I watched him die," Salgado muttered, mostly to himself. "I saw the flames." "Then maybe, Señor," Reyes said through broken teeth, "you were looking at the wrong ghost." Salgado crouched eye to eye with the bleeding man. "He killed 12 of my men, in silence, in the rain. Do you know what it's like to hear death move?" Reyes said nothing. Salgado stood, turned away. "Bring me the sicario," he ordered. A few minutes later, a tall figure stepped into the room. He wore a steel mask, handmade, scarred, shaped like a wolf's snarl. His name was Mateo Vargas, but around these parts, they only called him one thing, El Lobo. He was Salgado's blade, a ghost killer. The kind of man who didn't speak unless it was the last thing someone would ever hear. Salgado handed him a photo. "Roy, taken from the drone feed. I want his heart," Salgado said. "I want his wife's screams. I want their land burned. I want the chickens dead." El Lobo said nothing. He turned and walked out. Salgado looked down at Reyes again. "Tell me one last thing." Reyes blinked. "What?" "What did he do when—" "They came for his farm." Reyes hesitated. Salgado raised an eyebrow. "He didn't run," Reyes whispered. "He didn't scream." "Then what?" Reyes shook, the memory rattling inside him like a bell. He smiled. Salgado froze. A long pause. Then a slow, terrifying grin crept across his face. "Good," he said. "Let's see how long it lasts." Back in Wyoming, Roy Tanner loaded the last of the gear into the back of his truck. No license plate, no insignia, just a matte gray Chevy with an engine that growled like it wanted to start a war. Linda came out from the house holding a manila folder. "I talked to Marcy at the sheriff's office," she said. "She's going to feed the animals, and she doesn't ask questions." "Good," Roy replied, tightening the straps on the duffel. Inside 2 custom pistols, a handmade fighting knife, surveillance gear, encrypted comms, and a black book full of names that had tried very hard to stay forgotten. "You sure you want to go alone?" Linda asked. Roy looked out toward the horizon. The mountains were shadowed, distant, still snow-kissed. "I'm not going alone," he said. Linda raised an eyebrow. "Mason's got people," he added. "Not all of them dead yet. We meet at the line, then we cross." She stepped forward, touched the collar of his jacket. "You come back," she whispered, "or I come find you." Roy kissed her forehead. "Either way," he said. "This ends." Midnight. The border. Roy stood in the brush, night vision goggles humming faintly, scanning the terrain. To his left, Mason was crouched with a suppressed scar rifle and a half-scowl that hadn't changed in 15 years. "You're really doing this," Mason muttered. "I already did it," Roy said. "This is just clean-up." "It's a fortress." "Roy, Salgado's got mercs, sicarios, drones, dogs." "He's got one thing wrong," Roy cut in. "What's that?" "He thinks he's the predator." Mason gave him a long look. "You sure you're ready for this?" Roy turned slightly, eyes gleaming beneath the goggles. "I was born for this." And then he slipped into the dark, silent, smooth, and lethal. The hunter had crossed the line. They moved like smoke. Roy, Mason, and 2 ghosts from their old unit, Deacon and Alvarez, crept through the ravine beneath the fortress's southern wall. The stars were dim, but their night optics painted the desert in sharp contrasts. Every rock, every shadow, every careless sentry on the roofline. "El Lobo's inside," Mason whispered. "Intel says Salgado keeps him close." "Good," Roy replied. "Easier to kill both." The plan was simple. Breach the wall, plant charges at the fuel depot, get eyes on Salgado's warboard, then vanish like spirits. But plans were lies. It was muscle memory that saved you when the plan broke. Deacon moved ahead, lean, fast, mean as a cornered wolf. He laid the first set of thermite charges against the metal grate, shielding the ventilation shaft. Alvarez watched the drones above, tracking their search pattern. 17-second loop, go on 3. Roy nodded. 3, 2, 1. The fire sizzled silently as the grate melted away, and the team slipped inside the fortress like a virus into the bloodstream. What they didn't know was this. El Lobo had already scented them. In a dark room lined with screens and infrared monitors, El Lobo stood silently as a blip appeared on the motion sensors. Not a rat. Too smooth. Not one of Salgado's men. Too quiet. He didn't call for backup. He just pulled the blade from his belt, a curved steel fang forged in Colombian fire, and stepped into the shadows. Roy led the team through a concrete corridor lit by the faintest emergency strips. Old. Habits kicked in. Check corners, breathe light, don't think, don't hesitate. They found the operations room on level 3. The door was locked. 10 seconds, Deacon said, working the pad. Roy scanned the hallway. Empty. Too empty. Something. Felt. Off-click. The door slid open. They slipped inside and froze. The warboard covered the far wall. Digital screens, troop maps, shipment routes, satellite overlays. But it wasn't the data that made Roy's blood run cold. It was the photos. Dozens of them. On the wall. Pinned like trophies. Linda. The house. Their farm. Even the creek where they used to fish. Mason whispered, "Jesus." But Roy wasn't hearing him. He was somewhere else, somewhere colder. "This isn't just business to him," Roy said. "No," Mason replied grimly. "It's personal." Roy pulled a flash drive from his vest and plugged it into the terminal. "Get everything," he said. But as the data transferred, the lights cut out, total darkness. And then footsteps. Slow. Measured. Metal on stone. "El Lobo," Alvarez hissed. "No guns," Roy whispered. "He wants quiet. Let's give it to him." The wolf came through the dark, his mask catching just enough red light from the backup battery to make him look like a demon risen from the earth. No words, just violence. He lunged at Deacon first, blade flashing. The fight was fast, brutal. Steel, on bone, breath cut short by precision. Alvarez tackled him, trying to pin his knife hand, but El Lobo twisted like a serpent and drove the blade into his thigh. Roy moved in, no hesitation. He slammed El Lobo against the wall, elbowed the masked face and ducked the retaliating blade swipe by inches. Their bodies crashed into desks, monitors, chairs. Mason fired a stun round, non-lethal, but El Lobo absorbed it like pain was a language he spoke fluently. Roy finally pinned him to the floor and ripped the mask off. The face beneath was younger than expected, sharp, scarred. But what caught Roy off guard was the look in his eyes. Not rage, not fear, respect. "You're him," the man rasped in Spanish. "The ghost." Roy stared. "I buried men like you," Roy said coldly. "Then dig a grave for yourself." With a roar, El Lobo drove his forehead into Roy's skull and slipped free, disappearing into the shadows before another shot could be fired. The alarms blared to life. Time was up. They didn't escape clean. Alvarez limped, blood pouring from his leg. Deacon had 3 cracked ribs. Mason covered the rear, laying down smoke and suppressive fire. They blew the depot, torched the drones, and lit up the western wall as they fled into the ravine. Roy carried the drive in his chest rig, close to his heart. Inside it, names, routes, weapons caches, proof and revenge. At dawn, Salgado surveyed the wreckage. Black smoke curled into the sky. The depot was gone. 2 men were dead. One of them was his nephew. He turned to El Lobo. "You let him live?" "I studied him," El Lobo said. "Now I know how he moves." Salgado's jaw clenched. "I don't want his shadow. I want his head." El Lobo's eyes narrowed behind the mask. "Then send me to the farm." Back in Wyoming, Linda stood on the porch, coffee in hand, shotgun by the door. She felt the chill in the wind. The hunter was coming home, but so was the wolf. The first sign was silence, not the good kind, the peaceful kind that settles over a quiet Wyoming morning, the sound of wind whispering through pine. No, this silence was wrong. The birds were gone. The air was still, like even God was holding his breath. Linda knew before she opened her eyes. Something was coming. Roy sat in the barn sharpening a blade he hadn't touched in years. It was long, curved and mean, military issue but illegal now in most states. Not that it mattered, the kind of men they were dealing with didn't care about laws, only power and pain. Mason stepped in, a shotgun slung across his back, fatigue, lines under his eyes. "We've got movement," he said. "Crows scattered 3 miles down the ridge, tripwire on the south fence snapped." Roy stood, the knife glinting in his hand. "How many?" Mason shook his head. "Could be scouts." "Could be more, but it ain't deer." Roy nodded once, then walked to the house. Linda was already lacing up her boots. She didn't ask what was happening. Didn't need to. "You take the west window," Roy said. 2 mags in the crawl space. You remember the count? 12 in the clip, 1 in the pipe, she said. "Reload after 4, no mercy." That's why he married her. They came at dusk. A black van rolled up the county road, too clean for this part of the state, tires humming like a predator breathing. Behind it, 2 dirt bikes. And further back, scattered along the tree line, shadows, moved like snakes. Roy watched from the hayloft through his old sniper scope, the one that saw bodies drop in Kandahar. His hand didn't shake, not after all these years. Then he saw the mask, El Lobo. "He's here," Roy whispered. Mason's voice crackled through the radio. "Permission to greet them?" Roy smirked. "Send. Our regards." The first explosion took out the rear bike, Claymore rigged under a camouflage tarp near the fence post. The second blew the front tire off the van, flipping it sideways in a shriek of steel and flame. Screams followed, then gunfire. Linda opened up from the porch with an M4 she'd buried in the cellar after Roy retired. She hadn't fired it in years. But muscle memory was a funny thing. She stitched the tree line with precise bursts, dropping 2 men in ski masks before they ever knew where the shots came from. Inside the barn, Roy and Mason moved like ghosts. "They'll flank left," Roy said. "That's what I'd do. Then let's ruin their day." They met the first intruder near the water trough. He was young, maybe 19, scared but high on adrenaline. He raised his rifle. Roy broke his wrist. The boy screamed, and Roy silenced him with the butt of the blade, not because he had to, because mercy was gone. "You came to my house," Roy growled. "Now you pay the price." They dragged the boy behind the barn and zip-tied him to a post. Interrogation could. Wait. By nightfall, 10 men were dead. El Lobo was not one of them. He'd vanished again, slipping through the chaos like a shadow. But Roy knew he was still here, still watching. The man was a tactician, a hunter. He wanted Roy to feel it, the edge, the pressure, the fear of loss. He wanted him to break. But Roy Tanner didn't break. He burned. Later, as they patched the wounded and counted the dead, Linda walked out to the field where Roy stood, staring at the scorched wreckage of their old swing set. "I thought we left this behind," she said quietly. Roy didn't answer at first. Then, "We were never done, Lynn. Just on pause." He looked at her, eyes dark but clear. "I'll finish this," he said, "before it finishes us." She nodded. "Then do it fast, because next time they're not sending boys." 3 states away, in a Vegas penthouse draped in blood-red velvet, Salgado poured a drink and watched the drone footage. He saw El Lobo, wounded, limping slightly, but alive. And he saw Roy Tanner, older, grayer, but a fire in his eyes like men. "Possessed." "Tell me what you learned," Salgado said. El Lobo sat across from him, bandaging his ribs. "He's not a man," he replied. "He's a storm." Salgado leaned back in his chair and laughed, slow and cold. "Then let's build a flood." Back on the farm, Mason loaded the final body bag into the trailer. Roy handed him a flash drive. "What's this?" Mason asked. "Insurance," Roy said. "If I die, you give this to Sarah Holden at the bureau." Mason's brow furrowed. "You're not dying." Roy gave a tight smile. "Everyone dies. The question is when, and how many we take with us." Inside the house, Linda found the old box under their bed. The one labeled retirement. Inside, old uniforms, a dusty flag, photos of Roy's unit, and at the bottom, a single folded paper, a letter she wrote him 15 years ago, after. The mission in Fallujah. She read it again now. It ended with one line. "Come home to me." She closed her eyes and whispered, "Come home." But the war had already come home, and Roy Tanner was just getting started. Roy sat on the edge of the battered leather couch in the barn, staring at a map spread out across the table. The wind rattled the windows of the farmhouse like a warning, But inside, the only sound was the steady clicking of the pen he twirled between his fingers. Mason was pacing the room, his eyes never leaving the map. The line between Mexico and the US was a scar on the earth, a jagged, artificial thing that had drawn blood for years. Roy flicked the pen into his hand, looked up at Mason. "This is it. Salgado's moving south." Mason froze. "You're sure?" Roy tapped a location on the map, just south of the border, deep in the desert. "The cartel's not just running guns and drugs anymore," Roy said. "They've been pushing human trafficking, kidnapping girls, families too. Salgado's playing for keeps. The question is, what's he got hidden down there?" Mason shook his head. "It's not just about the money, is it?" "No," Roy said. "It's personal now." The first thing Roy did was make sure Linda was set up with the gear she'd need to get out if things went sideways. This wasn't a mission that would end with a handshake and a bottle of whiskey. The stakes were too high, and they knew it. "I'll be back in 48 hours, Roy said, checking his watch. "If I'm not, you know what to do." Linda didn't flinch. She didn't need to. "Come back alive," she said, and left it at that. By the time Roy and Mason crossed into Mexico, the sun had set, and the desert turned into a cold, unyielding wasteland. The van they were in was as nondescript as it could. Just another cargo van among hundreds, blending in with the night. They weren't here to make a statement. They were here to disappear. The plan was simple. Infiltrate Salgado's operation, find out what he was hiding in the underground, tunnels near Culiacan, and get out before anyone noticed. But Roy knew the truth. Plans had a funny way of falling apart. They'd been on the ground for 3 hours when they hit the first roadblock. It wasn't the standard cartel checkpoint. Those were easy enough to avoid, or at least neutralize with a few well-placed shots. This one was different. It felt more organized, like they knew exactly who was coming and where they were going. And that was when Roy knew they were being hunted. Mason's fingers tightened on the steering wheel as they approached the checkpoint. "I don't like this." Roy's eyes narrowed. "Keep driving." The men at the checkpoint were heavily armed and their uniforms were different, military grade, not cartel. As the van approached, the men stepped forward, rifles raised. Roy didn't hesitate. He leaned forward and grabbed the radio. "We've got trouble," he muttered into the mic. Then, without a second thought, he pulled out the Glock from his waistband and clicked the safety off. The gunfire was deafening, a cacophony of metal and blood. Roy's instincts kicked in, his hand moving almost before his brain could process the danger. He fired, dropping the closest guard with a single shot. Then another, a burst from the MP5 that sent a second guard flying backwards. Mason slammed the van into the nearest barricade, sending it crashing into the sand. The impact threw the men off balance, giving Roy just enough time to roll out of the van, gun drawn, scanning for targets. Behind him, Mason was already out of the vehicle, sprinting for cover. "We can't stay here." Roy nodded, his eyes flicking. Over the battlefield, the men were regrouping, but they weren't the kind of people who were used to losing. They were smart, well-trained. Roy's fingers tightened around the MP5. "Cover me," he said, and Mason gave a sharp nod. Roy sprinted toward the cover of an old adobe building. Shots rang out, but they missed, just a little too slow. Roy dove behind the wall, taking a moment to reload. He didn't need to see their faces to know who they were. These weren't just cartel soldiers. These were something worse, Salgado's personal army, the ones who didn't answer to anyone but him. And Roy had no illusions about their intentions. They weren't there to stop him. They were there to kill him. It took them 20 minutes to break through, and even then, they were fighting with everything they had. Blood soaked into the desert floor, mixing with the dirt and the sand. Roy's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as he pushed forward, the adrenaline of battle surging through his veins. But every step he took, every corner he turned, it felt like the walls were closing in. He knew Salgado had his hands in a lot of things, but this was different. He wasn't just hiding in plain sight anymore. He was creating something dangerous, something that would have the power to tear the region apart. And if Roy didn't stop him now, it wouldn't just be Mexico that would burn. It would be everything, Dietzi. The end of the firefight, when the dust settled and the bodies were counted, Roy and Mason were standing at the edge of the highway, staring at the wreckage of their van. "We've got 5 dead," Mason said, wiping blood from his forehead. "No way they're the only ones." Roy didn't say anything. His eyes were scanning the horizon. He could feel it, like a storm on the edge of the world, the kind of storm you couldn't outrun. And he could hear Salgado's voice, whispering, "On the wind." Back in the States, Linda sat in the silence of the farmhouse, watching the clock tick. She hadn't heard from Roy in hours, but she wasn't worried. Not yet. But she had learned long ago to trust her gut, and her gut was telling her this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. She stood up, pulled the phone from her pocket, and dialed the number she'd memorized years ago. It was time to call in the cavalry. The firelight flickered inside the small hideout they'd taken refuge in, casting long shadows on the cracked adobe walls. Roy sat at the table, the map spread out in front of him like a puzzle he couldn't solve. Mason was behind him, cleaning his rifle, his eyes never far from the door. They'd been on the run for 3 days now, barely stopping to catch their breath. But Roy's instincts told him they were closing in on something big, too big to ignore. Salgado's operation wasn't just about drug running and guns. It was much deeper, and it wasn't just limited to the border. It stretched across continents, touched the lives of thousands, maybe millions. "What the hell is he doing?" Mason muttered under his breath, breaking Roy's concentration. "This doesn't make sense. This guy's untouchable." Roy's eyes remained fixed on the map, tracing lines that led from the border to various points on the map. "That's the thing, Mason. He's not untouchable, he's just been careful." Salgado had covered his tracks well. Every lead they'd followed had led them in circles. Every contact had come up empty. Roy knew they were up against someone who knew how to operate in the shadows. But shadows could only hide for so long. They were getting closer. And Roy could feel it. The next morning they moved out early, slipping through the barren roads that led deeper into Mexico. The scent of dust and dry earth was all around them as they headed toward a town called San Miguel. It was small, overlooked, a place no one would ever think to look, but that was the point. San Miguel wasn't just a town, it was a key part of Salgado's operation. That much Roy knew now. It was the place where everything converged, from weapons to people to cash. Everything was moved through here, and Roy's job was to find out how and why. They entered the town under the cover of darkness, parked their vehicle in an alleyway, and moved out on foot. Roy could feel the weight of every step, every breath. This was it. They were getting too close now for comfort. Inside a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of town, Roy and Mason found the first signs of Salgado's true power. It wasn't just drugs or guns. It was something far worse. They had stumbled upon rows of cages, human cages, young women, children, families. Roy's gut clenched as he surveyed the horror before him. The lights overhead flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. In one corner, a man sat on a crate, his hands bound with thick rope. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow from days, maybe weeks, of being trapped here. He looked up when they entered, but didn't move. Roy stepped forward cautiously, pulling a small flashlight from his belt and shining it on the man. "Where's Salgado?" The man didn't respond at first, his lips cracked, parched. Then, slowly, he whispered, "He's gone. He's not here anymore, but they're coming for you." Roy's blood ran cold. "Who's coming for me?" "The men," the man said, his voice shaking. "The ones who work for him. They'll find you." Mason stepped forward, gun in hand, but Roy put his hand on his shoulder. "We don't need to kill him, not yet. We need information." The man met Roy's gaze, his eyes full of fear. "You don't understand. You've been looking for Salgado, but you're chasing shadows. He's not the one you need to worry about." Roy raised an eyebrow. "Then who?" "The general," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. Roy's mind went still. "What general?" The man coughed, his eyes darting around. "General Rohr. He's the one behind everything. Salgado's just the front." Roy's heart pounded in his chest as the name echoed in his mind. General James Rohr. It wasn't just a name from the past. It was a name tied to operations that no one talked about, missions that had never been declassified, the kind of man who operated in the darkest corners of the world, pulling strings from the shadows, hidden behind layers of power. And now, Roy realized, the man wasn't just an old ghost from his past. He was real. He was here. And he was pulling the strings of Salgado's operation. By the time they left the warehouse, Roy's mind was racing. He had thought Salgado was the threat, but now he understood. This was much bigger than that. Roy wasn't just some retired general. He was the orchestrator, the one who had been pulling the strings all along. Mason kept his voice low as they walked through the alleys, heading back to the van. "What do we do now?" Roy didn't answer immediately. His brain was working, calculating, strategizing. They had no idea how deep Roy's influence went or who was working for him, but they knew one thing. They couldn't stop now. Not after everything they had uncovered. "We keep moving forward," Roy said, his voice low but steady. "We need to find out what Roy's planning, and we need to take him down before this whole thing implodes." It wasn't long before the realization hit him like a freight train. They weren't just fighting a drug cartel or an international human trafficking ring. They were up against a shadow operation so vast it could topple governments, rewrite laws, and destroy lives without leaving a trace. This was about power, the kind of power that could make men like Salgado disappear without a second thought, and Roy had no illusions left. This wasn't just a mission, it was war. The next night, after making contact with their remaining sources in Mexico, Roy received an encrypted message, an address, a name. Salgado was dead, and Roy was moving in. They had to act fast. Roy's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as the van hummed along the narrow, empty road. The Mexican night pressed close around them, thick with heat and silence. But Roy's mind was 1,000 miles away, racing through memories, old plans, strategies. Mason sat beside him, his eyes scanning the darkened landscape. He hadn't said a word since the encrypted message had come through, but Roy could feel the tension in the air between them. Mason finally broke the silence, his voice low, like he didn't want the night to hear. "You sure about this? I mean, we're talking about taking on the Shadow Man himself. Roy is a ghost, a damn good one." Roy didn't take his eyes off the road. The headlights cut through the dark, but it felt like they were chasing something that didn't want to be found. "I know what I'm getting into, Mason, but there's no turning back now. We've already found the cracks, and once we're inside, it'll be too late to back off." Mason grunted, obviously not convinced. "I've seen men make worse decisions. Doesn't mean we have to be those men." Roy's jaw tightened. "The thing is, Mason, we can't afford to be anyone. Hell's not this time. We've uncovered something bigger than either of us, and I don't trust the people we're up against to stop once they've started. Salgado was just a pawn. Roy's the king." Mason nodded slowly, his gaze lingering out the window as if trying to see into the future. "And what's our move once we find him?" Roy's eyes narrowed. "We take him out, but not just him, his whole operation. We can't leave any loose ends." Mason's voice hardened. "And if we're not in time, what happens if he's already moved?" Roy's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles white. He didn't have an answer for that, but he wasn't about to show any weakness now. Not when everything they had fought for was on the line. It wasn't long before they reached the outskirts of the town, where the encrypted message had pointed them. The address was a warehouse near an old oil refinery, abandoned for years but still operational enough for a man like Roy to use it for whatever dark plans he had brewing. Roy parked the van at a distance, and they slipped into the shadows, moving low and quiet toward the warehouse. Roy's mind was spinning with calculations. Roy wasn't someone who could be confronted head-on. They would need to be smart, strategic, like they had been for every mission in the past. As they neared the building, Roy motioned for Mason to take the left side while he went right. The darkness wrapped around them like a cloak, giving them the cover they needed. "Ready?" Roy whispered, his voice barely audible. "Born ready," Mason muttered back. They crept closer, staying low to the ground. The warehouse loomed ahead, its metal walls streaked with rust and time. Roy could hear the hum of electricity inside, the faint sound of machines running. Maybe cameras scanning the perimeter, maybe guards. There was no way to know for sure, but Roy's instincts told him this wasn't just a simple hideout. This was something much bigger. The closer they got, the more Roy could feel the weight of the operation pressing down on him. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for a future that hadn't yet been written, a world that might change forever if Raw's plans came to fruition. They reached the side door, and Roy crouched beside it, pulling out a set of lockpicks. The faint sound of footsteps inside made him freeze. He motioned for Mason to stay still. A guard passed by the door, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. Roy's heart raced as he held his breath. The last thing they needed was a confrontation before they even got inside. The guard moved on, and Roy quickly unlocked the door. He cracked it open just enough to slip through, signaling Mason to follow. Inside, the warehouse was a labyrinth of boxes, old equipment, and storage containers stacked high. The smell of oil and metal filled the air, mixing with the faint scent of sweat and fear. Roy moved silently through the aisles, his every sense on high alert. They rounded a corner and froze. There, in the center of the warehouse, was a room. Locked, tight, but the sound of voices came from inside. Not just any voices, but the sound of men speaking in low, urgent tones. Roy held up his hand to stop Mason. He moved closer to the door, pressing his ear to the cool metal. His breath slowed, his heartbeat steady. He had to hear everything, every word, before they made their move. "He's expecting us. We can't afford to fail this time. The shipments are critical. Once they hit the border, we'll have the leverage we need." Roy's mind raced. The shipments. Leverage. They were talking about something big, something that would change the course of the operation. "I'll handle it." "No one gets through, not this time. We can't let Roar's plans fall apart because of some small hiccup." The voice was cold, controlled. It wasn't Roar's voice, but it was close enough to send a shiver down Roy's spine. "They'll be here any minute," the other voice said. "Are we ready for them?" "Of course, we've been ready since the beginning. We'll shut them down before they even know what hit them." Roy stepped back, motioning for Mason to follow him. They had to act now. Roar wasn't here yet, but whoever these men were, they knew they were being hunted. With a final glance toward the door, Roy and Mason moved swiftly, making their way to the back of the warehouse. The next few minutes were crucial. If they could take out the guards and disable the machines, they could stop the shipments from leaving. The operation had to be stopped here. The risks were too high. Roy drew a breath, his mind steeling for what was to come. This was it. It wasn't just a fight anymore, it was the beginning of the end. The air inside the warehouse smelled like metal, sweat, and something darker, something dangerous. Roy's boots padded silently across the cold concrete floor, his mind already calculating the next steps. The sounds of muffled voices from behind the locked room were a constant reminder of what was at stake. Mason, moving like a shadow beside him, adjusted his gear, eyes scanning every corner. "We can't let them get the upper hand, Roy," Mason murmured, his voice tight. "You know how fast things can go sideways with these kinds of operations." Roy nodded without speaking. His entire life had been built on going into places like this, where shadows ruled and men made their own rules. He'd done it 1,000 times before, but this time felt different. They weren't just hunting criminals, they were after a ghost, a man who had hidden himself in the shadows for too long. They rounded a corner, and Roy felt his pulse quicken. The room ahead of them was illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. It wasn't just any room, it was the heart of the operation, and they were about to crash it wide open. Roy motioned for Mason to take the left. The plan was simple. Hit hard, hit fast, and hit first. They couldn't afford to let any of the enemy get away. If they did, the whole mission would be compromised, and worse, they'd have Roar and his team on their backs before they could blink. With a single hand signal, Roy kicked the door open. The men inside froze for a moment. There were 4 of them. 2 were armed with rifles, the other 2 standing behind large crates, likely watching security monitors. The moment the door slammed open, the men reached for their weapons, but Roy was faster. Before anyone could react, Roy moved like a blur. His training kicked in, his instincts taking over as he fired 2 quick shots. The sound of gunfire echoed off the concrete walls, and the closest man dropped, his rifle clattering to the floor. Mason was right behind Roy, taking out the second man with a well-placed shot to the chest. The room filled with chaos, shouting, the sound of feet scrambling on the floor, the metallic clang of weapons being drawn. Roy barely had a moment to breathe before the third man opened fire, A burst of rounds flying toward him. Roy ducked behind a stack of crates, his heart racing, the world shrinking into the space between breaths. Mason moved with fluid precision, positioning himself behind another set of crates, firing toward their attackers. "Stay low," Roy barked to Mason. "We need to keep them off balance. Don't let them regroup." The remaining men tried to find cover, their movements erratic. But Roy had been in enough firefights to know how these things went. If you gave them an inch, they would take a mile. He couldn't afford that. Roy checked his clip and quickly snapped into a new position. He glanced at Mason, who gave him a quick nod. He was ready. Roy then turned to face the enemy, his mind calculating the next move. One of the men on the opposite side of the room stepped out from behind a crate, rifle raised, ready to fire. Roy didn't hesitate. He aimed, pulling the trigger in a single smooth motion. The man dropped to the floor, his weapon slipping from his grasp. But the fourth man, he wasn't in sight. Roy's mind raced as he quickly assessed the situation. Where was he? The tension in the room escalated, the seconds dragging like hours. Roy's fingers tightened around his gun, and he scanned every corner of the warehouse. He couldn't afford any surprises. Just as he was about to make a move, a soft click sounded behind him. The door, the only exit, slammed open, and a team of armed men stormed inside. Roy spun around just in time to see a figure emerge, a tall man wearing tactical gear with a red insignia on his chest. "General Raw's orders!" the man yelled, his voice cutting through the din of gunfire. "Get them alive! We can't risk more dead bodies!" The room went still for a moment, as if the chaos paused to recognize the new arrival. Roy's mind screamed, and his body moved on autopilot. The moment they saw the enemy, they would act. "Get down," Roy shouted to Mason, but it was too late. The door behind them burst open, and a flood of men in tactical gear poured in, rifles raised. There was no time to fight, no time to think. It was do or die. "Move!" Roy shouted again, his voice urgent as he grabbed Mason by the arm and pulled him toward the far corner of the room. They had to find another way out. But it wasn't just about getting out anymore. The fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. The chaos of gunfire and shouted orders reverberated through the cold industrial warehouse. Roy's heart raced as his mind scrambled for a way out. There was no more time for calculations, no more thinking in neat, tidy lines. The situation had just escalated into something far worse. "Keep moving," Roy snapped at Mason, who was already on his feet, rifle in hand. The floor beneath their feet seemed to vibrate from the impact of heavy boots pounding the concrete. They had no choice now. The moment the second group of armed men entered, it was no longer a tactical operation. It was survival. Roy's mind flicked back to his years in the field. The same survival instincts that had saved his life in countless operations now had to guide him through this. But there was something different about this enemy. Something he hadn't anticipated. The man with the red insignia, the one who'd ordered them to take prisoners, was now moving toward them with two others. They didn't move like ordinary soldiers. They moved with precision, with purpose, like a well-trained unit that had been through this 1,000 times before. It was clear they had their own mission, and Roy wasn't sure whether he was a part of it or just an obstacle. He couldn't let them take Mason, not now. "Stay low," Roy ordered, his voice sharp, as he tugged Mason toward a row of steel beams that provided some cover. The team in the warehouse moved quickly, sweeping through the aisles, their footsteps heavy and sure. But something wasn't right. Roy could feel it in his gut. These men, these soldiers, they were too familiar with how he fought, too comfortable with the battlefield. Roy could see the small details, the flash of an insignia just visible beneath the tactical gear, the deliberate way they positioned themselves for maximum coverage. These weren't just any mercenaries or hired guns. These were military professionals. Trained men who had likely crossed paths with Roy before. "Get down!" Mason's voice was urgent as he pulled Roy back, just as a round zipped past his ear. Roy crouched low behind a crate, fingers pressing into the cool metal as he fought to steady his breathing. His mind raced through every possible strategy, but all he could hear now was the thud of his own heart. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not like this. "How did they know?" Mason whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. "We weren't supposed to be a target. Not yet. Roy glanced at Mason, eyes narrowing. Doesn't matter. What matters is getting out of here alive. That's not all that matters, Mason shot back, his voice rising in frustration. We can't just run, Roy. We're supposed to stop them. Whatever they're planning, we will, Mason. Roy's voice was firm, cold even. His grip tightened on his rifle. But first we survive. There was a sudden burst of movement. The soldiers had split into smaller teams, flanking them from either side. Roy's instincts kicked in. He didn't have time to wonder how or why. This had gone sideways. There were no questions now, only action. Move, Roy barked, his hand on Mason's shoulder as they sprinted toward the far end of the warehouse. They couldn't stay in one place, not with men closing in on both sides. The cold steel of the beams around them seemed to press in, narrowing their options, until the only way out was through. They reached a set of high windows on the far side of the room. Roy's mind worked rapidly, considering their options. If they could make it outside, they had a chance, maybe even a slim one, but the window was closing. Mason quickly scanned the area, his eyes darting between the soldiers now advancing toward them. There's a door to the back alley, he said urgently. If we get to it, we can get some distance. Roy's gaze followed Mason's pointing finger. The back alley was their best option, but the soldiers were already closing in on that side of the room. They didn't have much time. They would have to fight their way through. But Roy wasn't thinking about escape anymore. He was thinking about what had to come next. His years in the field had taught him one thing. When faced with an overwhelming enemy, you either give everything you've got, or you let them overwhelm you. Ready? Roy asked, his voice low, barely a whisper. Mason's jaw set. Always. Roy didn't wait for a second command. He surged forward, rifle raised, eyes focused on the advancing soldiers. They had to know he was here by now. He couldn't hide anymore. There would be no stealth, no quiet takedowns, only the storm. Gunfire exploded from both sides as they raced toward the door. Roy's rifle snapped to his shoulder as he squeezed off a quick burst, taking down the closest soldier before ducking behind another stack of crates. We need to keep moving, Roy shouted, his voice filled with urgency. There was no time for second thoughts. They had to push forward. Mason followed close behind, firing at a soldier who had flanked them from the side. The man dropped, but not before he managed to send a hail of bullets in their direction. Roy winced as a round whizzed past his shoulder, the rush of air sending a shiver down his spine. To the door, Roy yelled, pushing Mason toward the opening. They dove through the doorway just as more gunfire erupted behind them. The alley outside was dark, narrow, and claustrophobic, but it was their only shot. The sound of their heavy breathing was the only thing that filled the space as they sprinted toward the end of the alley. We can make it, Mason said, panting. Roy didn't answer. He knew better than to make promises in moments like this. All he could do was focus on getting them to safety and figuring out how to end this fight once and for all. The narrow alleyway offered little comfort as the darkness closed in around them. Roy's pulse thrummed in his ears, the adrenaline rush pumping through him like a heavy drug. They had escaped the immediate danger, but the real question lingered like a shadow over them. Why had the operation gone wrong? Who had tipped these men off to their exact location? Roy and Mason didn't speak as they sprinted through the alley. There was no time for questions, only action. They had reached the end of the alley, where the street opened into a dimly lit intersection. Roy's eyes darted around the surroundings. A car parked under the flickering streetlight, the hum of distant traffic, the creeping cold of the night, settling over everything. Nothing seemed out of place, yet everything felt wrong. We've got to keep moving, Roy said, his voice low but commanding. Mason nodded but didn't respond. His rifle was slung across his back now, his posture tense, alert. He knew as well as Roy that their survival depended on their ability to stay ahead of whatever was hunting them. There was a beat, then a low hum of an engine filled the space. Get down, Roy ordered, instinct kicking in as he shoved Mason behind. A stack of wooden pallets. The sleek black SUV appeared from around the corner, moving slowly but deliberately. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the street in stark white light. The vehicle slowed as it approached. making Roy's chest tighten. It wasn't just a passing car. It was here for them. Roy gripped the side of the pallet, his breath steady despite the urgency in his chest. He didn't need to look at Mason to know he was ready. They both understood the stakes now. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. This had become personal. These weren't just rogue soldiers. They were part of something bigger, something dangerous. The SUV stopped just yards away from where Roy and Mason crouched, its engine purring softly. Two men emerged from the vehicle. Their movements were practiced, too fluid to be anything other than military training. "I don't like this," Mason whispered, gripping his rifle tighter. "You don't have to," Roy's he replied, his voice calm as he scanned the men. "But we're going to have to deal with it." The men moved with precision, scanning their surroundings before walking toward the entrance to the alley. One of them wore a dark jacket, his face obscured by a pair of thick sunglasses. The other was younger, maybe in his 30s, but just as hardened, just as dangerous. Roy's mind raced as he calculated their options. Their only hope now was to confront the situation head-on. No more running, no more hiding. It was time for answers. Time for a reckoning. As the two men got closer, Roy motioned for Mason to follow him. He didn't want to get caught in the open, but there was no avoiding it now. The element of surprise had been lost. With a sharp nod, Mason silently followed him as they shifted to a position behind a nearby dumpster, both of them crouching low. Roy reached for his sidearm, checking the safety before slipping it into his holster. He wasn't planning on shooting just yet, but that could change quickly. The men came into view, their boots echoing on the concrete as they approached. One of them paused, his eyes scanning the alley. The other continued forward, not noticing Roy and Mason hiding in the shadows. Roy's mind worked quickly. There had to be a reason why these men were after him. Something wasn't right. There was no way this was just a coincidence. It was more than that. Whoever they were working for had anticipated their every move. As if reading his thoughts, the older man with the sunglasses turned his head and stared directly at Roy's hiding place. The sharp glint of recognition passed through his eyes, just a flicker before it was masked by a calm expression. "Well, well," the older man said, his voice smooth, calculating. "We've been expecting you, Roy Tanner." Roy didn't flinch. He stayed in place, barely breathing. It was as if time slowed down. The tension hung in the air like a thick fog. "I don't know who you think you are," Roy said, his voice steady, betraying no hint of fear. "But you've got the wrong man. We're just trying to get out of here." The man's lips curled into a smirk. "Oh, I think you know exactly who we are, Roy. The question is, how long did you think you could hide from us?" Mason tensed. Beside Roy, his fingers brushing the stock of his rifle. Roy held up a hand, signaling him to wait. They weren't there for a fight. Not yet. They needed more answers. "I don't have time for games," Roy said, his voice low but sharp. "You want something? Then say it." The older man took a step forward, the cool night air swirling around him as he sized Roy up. "I think you'll want to hear this, Roy," he said with quiet menace. "We've been watching you for a long time. It wasn't just the mission in the warehouse that brought us here. We've known about your past, about your connections. You can't outrun this, no matter how hard you try." Roy's mind was already calculating the implications of the man's words. They knew about his history, about his service, about his reputation. They weren't just after a retired soldier anymore. They were after something much bigger. "What do you want?" Mason demanded, stepping slightly in front of Roy. But Roy's hand gently stopped him. "Answers, Tanner," the man replied coldly. "Your reputation precedes you. The work you did, the methods you used to save your country, the world, it's all valuable to someone who knows how to use it. And we know how to use it." Roy's gaze locked on the man's. No fear in his eyes, but the weight of the truth settling heavily in his gut. The younger man with him stepped forward then, his voice cutting through the air. "We don't have to do this the hard way, Roy. Just give us what we want and you'll get out of this alive. It's simple. Just tell us where it is." Roy's pulse quickened as his mind raced. They weren't asking about money or drugs. They were asking about something he hadn't thought about in years, something from his past, something classified. For the first time in what felt like forever, Roy allowed himself to feel the full weight of the situation. These men weren't here by accident. They were here for him. But Roy Tanner wasn't going down without a fight. The cold air felt like a slap in the face as Roy and Mason stood, facing the two men in the alley. The weight of the situation settled over Roy, and for a split second he felt like a younger man again. The years didn't matter when you were staring down your demons. He had done it before, many times in places far worse than this, but the stakes had never been higher. These men, whoever they were, didn't just want to destroy him. They wanted to use him to control the very skills and knowledge he had spent decades building. The older man in the sunglasses stared at Roy with an unnerving calm. His eyes didn't betray any hint of emotion, but Roy could see the calculation behind them. They had done their homework. They knew more than they let on. That much was clear. The younger man, whose eyes flickered with impatience, took another step forward, his boots scraping against the pavement. "We're not playing games here, Tanner. We know who you are, we know what you've done, and we know what you're hiding." Roy's mind clicked into high gear. His training kicked in, the training that had kept him alive in countless situations. The same training that had never truly left him, no matter how long he'd been out of the game. He stayed calm, his breathing slow and deliberate, but inside his thoughts were racing. They were looking for something. They knew it was hidden. And it wasn't just some random piece of intel. It was something far more valuable. "I don't know what you're talking about," Roy said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "I retired a long time ago. I've got nothing left for you." The older man smirked, stepping closer. "That's where you're wrong. Roy, you don't get to retire from this kind of life. Not when you've been a part of it for as long as you have. You can try to hide in that garage of yours, pretend you're just a guy fixing cars, but we both know you're not just that." Roy didn't respond. He didn't need to. The man was right. Roy had tried to bury everything. The operations, the black ops missions, the lies. But you couldn't outrun your past. Not when it had a hold on you like this. The younger man leaned in closer, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "We know about the mission, Tanner, the one that went south. We know what you did, what you were supposed to do, and we know what happened after. You've got secrets, don't you? Secrets that could get a lot of people hurt if they ever came to light." Roy's eyes narrowed as the words sank in. They were referring to something specific, something that, if exposed, would change everything. It was the kind of mission that, if revealed, would shake the very foundations of everything he had worked. For a mission that had gone wrong, and for good reason. The kind of operation that the world never saw, one that had never made it to the history books. His heart pounded as the pieces started to fall into place. They weren't just after him, they wanted the truth. And they wanted it badly enough. To risk everything to get it. "Why are you really here?" Roy finally asked, his voice low, full of quiet authority. "You're not looking for a simple civilian like me. You're here for something bigger. Something I buried a long time ago." The older man chuckled, the sound cold and cruel. "You're smarter than I thought. But it doesn't matter, you can try to play coy, but we know where it is. We just need you to tell us where to find it." Roy's stomach twisted, his mind spinning as he put the pieces together. They weren't looking for a man. They were looking for a file, a key to something much more dangerous. Something classified, something that, if exposed, could dismantle entire networks. The younger man took another step forward, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon. "Listen to me, Roy, this doesn't have to get ugly. You just tell us where it is and we'll walk away. No harm, no foul. But if you try to play us, if you refuse to cooperate, well, we both know how this ends." Roy didn't flinch. He had seen this before. The intimidation, the threats. It was all just a tactic, nothing more than a bluff. They didn't have the muscle to back up their words. Not against him. Not when he had more experience than they could even fathom. The tension in the air was thick. Roy's mind raced, weighing the consequences of his next move. He had two choices: give them what they wanted or refuse and risk the lives of those around him. His eyes flicked to Mason, who was still crouched behind the stack of crates, rifle in hand, waiting for the signal. "I'm not giving you anything," Roy said, his voice quiet but resolute. "If you want it, you'll have to take it, but be warned, you won't like what happens next." The older man smiled coldly. "You think you can scare us? You think you can take us down with a couple of old tricks? Roy Tanner, the ghost of a man who's been hiding for years? You're nothing." The words stung, But they didn't hit Roy where they wanted. He knew exactly what they were trying to do. They were trying to get him to break. But Roy Tanner wasn't some young soldier anymore. He had learned long ago that strength didn't come from anger. It came from knowing your enemy and playing the game better than they ever could. The older man gestured to his partner. The younger, one pulled out a small device and held it up, a tracking beacon. Roy's stomach sank. They had come prepared, and if they didn't get what they wanted from him, they would go after his family. After Linda. You've got until the count of 3. Roy, the older man said, his tone flat, emotionless. Tell us what we want to know or things will get much worse for you. Roy didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto the older man's, the quiet intensity of a man who had nothing left to lose. The man could threaten him all he wanted, but Roy would not break, not now, not ever. 3, the man began, his voice cold as ice. Roy stood tall. I said no. The younger man looked like he was about to pull the trigger, but the older man's hand shot out, stopping him. The two men stood motionless. For a long moment, the tension in the air palpable. And then, with a sudden shift, the older man lowered his hand. So you don't know when to quit, do you, Tanner? He said with a grim smile. Fine, we'll do this the hard way. The younger man gripped his weapon tighter, but Roy was already moving. He knew what was coming. They wanted to escalate it, to make him choose, and he would. But they hadn't expected him to fight back. The cold steel of the alley's walls felt like the sharp edge of a knife pressed against Roy's back. His breath was steady, measured as he watched the older man lower his hand. The game was about to change. The younger man's grip tightened on his weapon, but Roy wasn't intimidated. He had been in far worse situations, and the stakes had never been this high. Not when it came to Linda. The first shot rang out like a gunshot through the quiet night, but it wasn't aimed at him. It was aimed at the tracking device the younger man had been holding. Roy barely had time to register. What had happened before he was moving? His body reacting on instinct. The younger man's eyes widened in shock, his weapon now aimed at Roy. But before he could pull the trigger, Roy was already on top of him, disarming him with the fluid precision of a man who had spent too many years in the field to miss a beat. The gun hit the pavement with a sharp clatter, and before the man could react, Roy was already in motion again, his knee slamming into the man's chest, sending him sprawling. The older man didn't move, standing there like a stone statue, watching Roy's every move. You should have listened, Roy said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience. His eyes never left the older man's, the calm center of a storm that was only just beginning. The younger man gasped for air, but Roy wasn't done. He needed information, and he needed it now. Where's the file? Roy demanded, his voice a razor-sharp whisper. Where's the damn file? The older man took a slow step forward, his eyes still unreadable behind those dark sunglasses. You really think you can just come out here, start throwing punches and get what you want? You're a fool, Tanner. You don't know who you're dealing with. Roy's patience was wearing thin. He had played their game long enough. The younger man was still writhing on the ground, gasping for breath, but Roy barely spared him a second glance. His focus was locked on the older man now. Answer me, or your friend here gets more than a busted rib, Roy growled. The older man paused for a long moment, then finally spoke. You don't get it, do you? This isn't about the file. Not anymore. This is about you. Roy's stomach tightened at the words. There it was, the truth that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It wasn't about some classified mission or long-buried secret. It was personal. What are you talking about? Roy's voice was tight, the calm facade cracking just a little. The older man smirked. You've been running from your past for so long, but it's catching up with you, Roy. We know everything. We know about the mission that went south. We know about your ties to the CIA, to Delta Force, to all of it. We've been watching you for a long time. Roy's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't show it. His mind was racing, piecing together fragments of information that didn't quite make sense. These men weren't just after a file. They were after him, and everything that had followed him since his time in the military. You think I'm the one who's been hiding? Roy spat, his eyes narrowing. You think you know me? You've got no idea who you're dealing with. The older man took another step forward, his face still hidden behind those dark glasses. You're right about one thing, Tanner. You've done a good job of keeping yourself off the radar. But you've made mistakes. And now those mistakes are catching up with you. Roy's pulse quickened. He had kept his head low for years, living under the radar, hoping that the ghosts of his past would stay buried. But it wasn't enough. And these men were living proof of that. What do you want from me? Roy's voice was a low growl, barely contained. The older man tilted his head, the smirk still playing at the corners of his lips. We want what's ours, and we'll do whatever it takes to get it. Roy's mind clicked. The pieces started to fall into place. They weren't just after him. They were after something he had hidden. Something he had locked away and buried deep. The file. The one he had stolen from the agency all those years ago. It was the one thing that could ruin everything. The one thing that could tear apart his carefully constructed life. I don't have it, Roy said through gritted teeth, his voice a low hiss. If you think for 1 second I'm going to hand it over to you, then you leave us no choice, the older man interrupted, cutting him off. Without warning, the older man lunged at Roy, his movements faster than Roy had anticipated. He barely managed to sidestep the attack, feeling the rush of air as the man's fist grazed past his face. Roy moved on instinct, his hand reaching for the younger man's weapon that had fallen to the ground. He kicked it up with a fluid motion, catching it mid-air, and within seconds, the older man found himself facing the barrel of a gun. I don't want to do this, Roy said coldly, the gun aimed steady at the older man's chest. But I will if it means protecting the people I care about. The older man's smirk faded, and for the first time a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He took a small step back, his hands raised in surrender. You don't understand. This is bigger than you. It's bigger than your precious file. Roy didn't drop his guard. Then make me understand, because right now all I see is a couple of desperate men trying to threaten me into doing something I don't want to do. The older man's eyes shifted and Roy saw it. Fear, real fear. For the first time, Roy knew they were losing control. The situation was slipping through their fingers. And that was when he struck. Without another word, Roy pulled the trigger. The sirens were getting closer, louder with each passing second, and Roy didn't need to look over his shoulder to know they were coming for him. The weight of the gun still sat heavy in his hand, but it felt wrong. He had always known how to hold a weapon, how to use it when necessary, but he had never wanted to pull the trigger. Not like this. Not like tonight. He stood still in the alley, his eyes focused on the older man slumped against the brick wall, the blood staining his shirt already darkening in the dim light. Roy didn't feel the rush of victory. He didn't feel the satisfaction of taking control. No. He felt hollow, like he had crossed a line he could never return from. Get up, Roy muttered under his breath, his voice rough as gravel. Get up and walk away. But the older man didn't move, and Roy knew he was done. This wasn't a fight he could walk away from. The sound of the approaching sirens made Roy's muscles tense. The clock was ticking and he had precious little time. He had to go, but something about the situation was gnawing at him. The file. He needed to make sure it was still in his possession. His eyes darted to his jacket pocket, the place where he'd tucked it away in a hurry just hours before. As if the world had other plans, Roy's phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't need to look to know who it was. Linda. She always knew when something was off, when the storm was brewing, and right now she would be feeling the tremors of that storm. He couldn't go back to her like this. Not yet. Not when everything was so uncertain. With a resigned sigh, Roy pulled the phone out and pressed it to his ear, barely giving it a second thought. Roy? Linda's voice cracked, filled with worry. What's happening? Where are you? He clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to lie. She would never believe him if he said everything was fine, not after all the chaos, and he couldn't drag her into it. Not this time. I'm fine, Roy said, his voice steady despite the storm, in his chest. Stay inside. Lock the doors. Don't answer the door for anyone. There was a long pause on the other end, the silence stretching out between them. Roy could hear Linda's breath quicken, the fear in her voice unmistakable. She had lived through too much to be fooled by his calm tone. She knew, and yet she still trusted him. Roy, she said softly, her voice breaking. What happened? He didn't have an answer. Not a good one, anyway. He couldn't explain the weight of the decisions he had made, the mistakes that had led him. To this moment, all he knew was that he couldn't let her be part of it, not again, not after everything they had already been through. "I'll explain later," Roy promised, his voice low and urgent. "Just stay safe." With that, he hung up, the weight of the phone call settling heavily on his chest. He couldn't do this anymore. He couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding from the truth. But more than anything, he couldn't drag Linda into the mess he had created. The sirens grew louder, the red and blue lights flashing from the street corner. Roy's mind raced as he quickly scanned his surroundings. There was no way he could outrun them, not now, not with everything that had gone wrong. His only chance was to disappear, to leave before they could catch up with him. He turned toward the alley's dead end, scanning the shadows. There, a fire escape. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Roy made his way toward the ladder, every movement sharp, calculated. But as he reached the bottom rung, he froze. A man stood at the top of the ladder, blocking his escape. It wasn't just any man. It was the man he had hoped to avoid, the one who had been haunting him from the very beginning. General Rohr. "I don't think you're going anywhere, Tanner," Rohr said, his voice calm, almost too calm. There was no fear in him, no hesitation, just the quiet certainty of a man who had seen it all. Roy didn't speak. He couldn't. The weight of everything, the lies, the betrayals, the years of running, pressed down on him all at once. He wanted to argue, to fight his way out of this corner, but deep down he knew it wouldn't do any good. Not with Rohr standing in his way. Rohr took a step forward, his eyes scanning Roy's face. "You know why I'm here," he said quietly. "You know what happens next." "I didn't want this," Roy replied, his voice hoarse. He hadn't wanted any of this. He hadn't wanted to drag Linda into his past, but it was too late. There was no turning back now. "You made your choice, Roy," Rohr said. "And now we deal with the consequences." Roy clenched his fists, but he didn't speak. He knew better than to argue with Rohr. The general had always been the kind of man who spoke in silence, who made decisions without hesitation, without remorse. "You don't have to do this," Roy said finally, his voice a low growl. "You don't have to drag her into it." Rohr's eyes flicked to the street behind him, where the flashing lights could still be seen. "I'm not the one dragging anyone into anything, Tanner. You made your own bed." There was a cold finality to his words, and Roy knew it was too late to change anything. The wheels had been set in motion, and there was no stopping them. Rohr turned away, his movements deliberate and calculated. "You have two choices," he said over his shoulder. "You come with me, and we finish this, or you stay here and let the consequences unfold. The choice is yours." Roy stood there staring at Rohr's retreating figure. His mind raced, but there was nothing left to consider. There was no time for second-guessing, no time for regrets. Roy made his choice. Roy didn't need to be told twice. He didn't need to hear Rohr's words again. The choice had been clear, even if the decision had been harder than anything he'd ever faced before. He followed the general into the shadows, away from the blinding lights and chaos of the street. It felt like a lifetime ago that he'd made the choice to walk away from this life, but the truth was it had never really left him. It had just been dormant, buried beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise up and pull him back in. Rohr led him to an old, nondescript van, parked in the alleyway, the engine already running. It was as if they were trying to escape from the very thing they were about to face. Roy climbed in, settling into the seat next to the general, his mind still spinning from the events of the last few hours. There was nothing comforting about this van. Nothing about it felt like safety. It was a reminder of the life Roy had left behind, the one he thought he could escape. But there was no running from your past. Not when it followed you in the form of men like Rohr, who had seen it all, who knew everything about you, every move you made. The ride was silent, the tension thick between them. Rohr didn't need to say a word, and Roy didn't have the energy to argue. He'd been down this road too many times before, and he knew where it led. It didn't take long before the van stopped in front of a small, inconspicuous building on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that blended in with everything around. A place that could hold secrets if you knew where to look. Roy stepped out of the van, his boots hitting the pavement with a hollow thud. Roy didn't wait for him. He walked into the building without a glance back, and Roy followed, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. They entered a room that felt as sterile as it was cold, the flickering fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the walls. It was a place that felt wrong, a place that was built for nothing but secrets and silence. "Sit," Roy commanded, motioning to the chair in the center of the room. There was no room for argument, no room for questioning. Roy obeyed, the weight of the past pressing down on him with each passing second. Roy stood across from him, his posture rigid, his eyes cold. There was no warmth in his gaze, no sympathy. Just the same look Roy had seen so many times in the eyes of men who had made their peace with the darkness of the world. "Do you know why you're here, Roy?" Roy asked, his voice low but steady. Roy didn't answer. He didn't need to. He already knew. This wasn't about understanding the reasons anymore. This wasn't about redemption or making things right. This was about the cold truth. His past had caught up with him, and now there was no escaping it. "You made a mistake," Roy continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "You've been trying to walk away from this life for years, but you've always known deep down that it was never going to let you go." Roy clenched his fists, but he didn't say a word. He didn't need to argue. He had known the moment he walked away from the military that it wasn't a clean break. It wasn't a simple choice to just stop, to just disappear. There were always things that followed you, decisions you couldn't undo, lives you couldn't save, actions you couldn't take back. "You should have known better," Roy said, taking a step forward, his gaze narrowing. "You can't just walk away from this, Roy. Not when you've been the one pulling the strings for so long." "I never wanted to pull the strings," Roy finally spoke, his voice gravelly. "I never wanted to control anyone, to make the decisions that I did. I was just following orders." Roy's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's the problem, isn't it? You've always been the one who followed, the one who did what was needed. But now when it's time to stand up and take responsibility, you want to pretend it was all someone else's fault." Roy's fists tightened. The anger was there, bubbling just beneath the surface. But he couldn't let it out. Not now. Not with everything on the line. "You didn't have to bring her into this," Roy said, his voice tight. "You didn't have to make her a part of your plan." Roy's expression darkened. "She was never meant to be part of anything, but you've dragged her into this world whether you like it or not. You can't protect her from the choices you've made, Roy. You've exposed her to this life, and now there's no turning back." The words hit Roy harder than any bullet ever could. He had tried. He had spent years trying to protect Linda, trying to keep her safe from everything he had been involved in. But in the end, he had failed. He had failed her, just like he had failed everyone else. "You think I wanted any of this?" Roy asked, his voice breaking. "You think I wanted her to be in danger because of me?" Roy didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. The weight of Roy's past decisions hung heavily in the room, suffocating them both. For a moment, there was nothing but the harsh hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of sirens. Roy could hear his heart beating in his chest, the rhythmic thud reminding him that there was no going back. "You're not the man I knew," Roy said quietly. "How you used to be someone I could trust, someone who had a purpose. Now you're just a ghost." Roy's gaze hardened, his mind racing. He had never wanted to be a ghost. He had never wanted to disappear, to fade into the shadows of his own regrets. But he had. And now he wasn't sure if he could find his way back. The door behind them opened, and Roy knew that the time for talking was over. There were no more questions to be asked, no more answers to be found. They had come for him, and this time there was no escape. The room felt suffocating, every inch of space closing in on Roy as Roy's words echoed in his mind. "You're just a ghost." A ghost. The term had hit him harder than anything else that had been said to him in years. Not a man, not a hero. Just a shadow of the person he had once been, fading into nothingness. The door behind them creaked open again, but this time Roy didn't need to look to know who it was. The presence in the room shifted, and he felt it. The heaviness of expectation. The pressure that came with being in the company of men who had known him at his best and at his worst. General Roar didn't need to say anything. He had already delivered his verdict. It wasn't a matter of words anymore, but of action. They had come for him, expecting to find a ghost, and now they were about to see what he had become. A man with scars, a man who had lived through it. All but a man nonetheless, Roy, Roar said, his voice laced with a quiet authority. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about what happens next, about what you're willing to do with the knowledge you've gained, the experience you've accumulated. There's no turning back now. Roy stood up slowly, his back stiff. The truth was like a weight on his chest, suffocating him with each breath he took. He could feel the pull of his past, the calls to duty, to action, to finish what he had started. But he had already made his choice. He had walked away from that life, and he wasn't going back. What's next, Roar? Roy's voice was low, calm, but there was an edge to it now. Do you expect me to just pick up where I left off? To come back into this world like nothing's changed? Roar's eyes narrowed, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. You think this is about what you want? This isn't about what you want anymore, Roy. This is about what needs to be done. The world's still out of control, and there are people who still need you. Roy shook his head, his jaw tight. You don't get it, do you? I'm not the man you remember. I'm not the man you think I am. For a moment, Roar stood there silent, as if weighing his words carefully. Roy could see the calculation in his eyes. Roar had always been a man who understood power, understood leverage, but now Roy could see the cracks in that authority. He could see that even Roar, with all his years of experience, was starting to realize that the game had changed. I know. What you've done, Roar said, his voice quieter now, almost like a confession. I know you've walked away from everything, but I also know you, Roy. I know the man who could fix anything, the man who never turned his back on those who needed him. You still have that in you, and that's why we're here. Roy took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Roar's. You're wrong, he said, his voice steady. I've been fixing engines. I've been teaching kids how to use their hands, how to learn a trade. I've been living a quiet life, trying to forget all this. But the truth is, Roar, there's no fixing the past. There's no going back and undoing what's already been done. The tension between them was palpable. The weight of Roy's words hung in the air, thick and heavy. He knew what Roar wanted. He knew what they all expected. But he wasn't going to give it to them, not this time. You think I'm some kind of weapon, don't you? Roy continued, his voice rising slightly. That I'm still some soldier, who's ready to march back into battle and take on whatever's left. Well, I'm not. I'm not that man anymore. Roar's gaze hardened, but Roy didn't back down. He knew what he had to do. He knew that this was the moment, the tipping point. If he gave in now, if he allowed himself to be pulled back into that world, it would all be for nothing. All the years he had spent trying to build something real, something worth living for, would be lost. I'm done, Roy said, his voice final. I'm done with that life, done with the lies, the bloodshed, and the constant fight. I'm not the man who used to lead missions in the dark. I'm not the man who could pull the trigger without thinking twice. I'm a man who fixes things now, a man who takes pride in building, not destroying. For a long moment, Roar didn't speak. He just stared at Roy, as if trying to make sense of the man standing in front of him. The man who had once been a weapon, but now was something else entirely, something fragile, something human. Finally, Roar sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. You don't understand, do you? He said quietly. The world's not like it used to be. It's worse now. The stakes are higher. And people like you, Roy, people like you are the only ones who can make a difference. Roy shook his head, his resolve unwavering. I'm not doing this anymore. You want me to come back? To fight? To be the man I was? You're wasting your time. I'm not that person anymore, Roar. I'm not who you think I am. There was a long pause, and for the first time Roy saw the flicker of uncertainty in Roar's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Roar was beginning to see the truth. The world had changed, and Roy had changed with it. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He wasn't a weapon. He was just a man. You think you're done, Roar said quietly. But you're not. You'll never be done. There's always more to be done. Roy's voice was firm as he replied, Then let someone else do it. I'm done, I'm out. And with that, Roy Tanner turned his back on his past, on the life he had lived, and walked out of the room, leaving the shadows of his former self behind. As he stepped out into the cold air, Roy knew he was taking the first real step toward freedom. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be quick, but it was the right thing. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was finally moving forward. The road ahead wasn't clear, not by a long shot. But then, when had it ever been? Roy sat behind the wheel of his truck, the engine humming low beneath him as he glanced at the rearview mirror. His reflection seemed distant, like the image of a man he used to know, a man who had made decisions, with the kind of confidence that only came with a life spent in control. But now? Now all he saw was a man in transition, a man who had chosen to walk away, and yet couldn't entirely escape the pull of the past. The dusty roads of this forgotten town had once felt like a prison. Now they felt like the only place he had ever been free. He had worked hard to bury the ghosts, to lay them down in the fields of his past, and for a while he'd thought he could truly forget. But every time he looked into the eyes of the people, here it was like he saw them asking the same question he had asked himself 1,000 times. What's next? And the truth was, he didn't have an answer. Not one he was willing to give. He adjusted the rearview mirror once more, trying to push past the image of the man who had stood in that room with Roar. He was a stranger now, someone distant and unfamiliar, a man who had lived on the edge of death and danger for so long, he couldn't remember what it was like to just live. But now that was what he had to do. He had to learn what it meant to live again. And that meant facing the fact that he couldn't escape what had come before. He couldn't outrun it forever. He pulled the truck onto the side of the road, the wind ruffling his hair as he stepped out. The familiar quiet of the open plains stretched out before him, and for a moment, he could almost feel the weight of the world lifting from his shoulders. Here he wasn't Roy Tanner, the man who had once led missions behind enemy lines. He wasn't the weapon, the tool of destruction. Here he was just a man, breathing in the air and feeling the weight of the earth beneath his boots. As he walked, Roy didn't know where he was headed, and that was okay. He had no destination in mind, he had no plans, no grand ambitions. For the first time in a long time, he felt the freedom to simply be. He thought of the kids at the mechanic shop, the way their eyes lit up when they learned how to fix things with their own hands. He thought of the satisfaction that came from seeing something broken and turning it into something functional, something useful. Maybe that was his future. Maybe that was all he could offer now, building, fixing, teaching. Maybe he wasn't meant to be anything more than a small-town mechanic who helped people learn how to live a little bit better. A horn blared in the distance, snapping Roy out of his thoughts. He turned and saw the familiar beat-up car pulling up beside him. The window rolled down and there was Sarah, her brown eyes glistening with something between concern and curiosity. "You're not going to stand out here all day, are you?" she asked, her voice carrying the soft tone of someone who knew him too well. Roy couldn't help but smile. "I might," she laughed, a sound that made something shift in him, something he hadn't realized had been dormant for a while. A reminder of what it was like to be connected, to share space with someone who understood you, someone who wasn't asking for more than what you were willing to give. "Hey, you know," Sarah continued, "you've been a bit of a ghost lately, I get it. But if you're going to stick around, we all need to know what's going on with you." Roy sighed, looking out at the open landscape again. He didn't know what he could tell her. He wasn't sure if there was anything to say. But he owed her more than just silence, more than just the lingering echoes of a man who had already decided he was done with it all. "I'm trying to figure it out," he finally said, his voice rough. "Figure out what?" "Everything." "What comes next? How to stop running, how to live." She studied him for a moment, then nodded as if she understood more than he'd said. "You know," she said, "there's a difference between running away and moving on. And from what I can see, you're doing a little bit of both." Roy met her eyes then, and for the first time in weeks he didn't feel like he was staring at a stranger in the mirror. He felt like a man with a future, even if he couldn't quite define it yet. "I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out," he said. "How to stop running, how to stop being the person everyone expects me to be, and start being the person I'm supposed to be. Sarah didn't say anything more, but she didn't need to. Her silent understanding was enough. She'd been patient with him. And now it felt like maybe he was starting to be patient with himself. She drove off and Roy stood there for a long moment, the wind brushing against him. The horizon stretched wide and endless before him, like the future. Unpredictable, unknown, but full of possibility. Maybe he wasn't meant to save the world. Maybe his purpose wasn't wrapped up in the grand battles and victories he had once fought for. But there was something else, something simpler, something real, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Roy climbed back into the truck, the door creaking shut behind him. He turned the key in the ignition, and the engine rumbled to life. As he drove off into the horizon, he knew that he wasn't running anymore. He was moving forward, one step at a time. The days that followed were filled with small victories. Roy didn't measure them by the size of the task, but by the quiet satisfaction of completing something. Fixing a car, teaching a kid how to replace a spark plug, offering a friendly word to a neighbor. These things, these small, humble acts, were the only kind of power he believed in now. He had to admit there was a part of him that still wanted to feel that adrenaline, that rush of taking charge, making decisions that could shift the course of events with the snap of his fingers. But every time that itch crept up on him, he buried it. He would turn the wrench just a little tighter, refocus his attention on the task at hand, and let the world move on without him. He knew that didn't make him a hero. He didn't need to be one anymore. Roy spent most of his days now in the garage, working on cars that had been neglected too long. Sometimes people would drop by with broken engines or busted transmissions, and Roy would do what he had always done: fix it. No questions asked, no military-grade operations, no classified missions, just oil stains and carburetors. Just an honest day's work. He could feel the quiet settling over him, the calmness that came from a life without constant alertness, without the constant hum of danger just around the corner. It was peaceful in a way, almost too peaceful. But, in the stillness, he started to understand something. He hadn't been running away from his past. He had been running towards something else. Linda had healed physically, though there were still moments where he caught her staring off into space, her mind clearly wandering back to that afternoon. He didn't ask her about it. They both knew what had happened. What they didn't know was what it meant and what it would mean for their future. But they didn't need to talk about it. Not right now. Not until they were ready. One evening, after a long day of tinkering with a carburetor that just wouldn't cooperate, Roy was wiping his hands on a rag when Sarah showed up. She didn't knock, just walked right in like she owned the place, as she always did. "You know," she said, eyeing the garage with a mix of amusement and admiration, "I think you might be the only person I know who enjoys working on cars more than fixing problems." Roy glanced up, half smiling. "Isn't fixing cars the same as fixing problems?" "Not exactly," she said, crossing her arms as she leaned against the doorframe. "When you fix cars, you know exactly what you're dealing with. People. On the other hand..." She trailed off, her eyes lingering on him as though seeing through him. Roy set the rag down and wiped his brow. "People are a little harder to fix, huh?" "People are never the problem," she replied, her voice softening. "It's the choices they make that create the mess." He leaned against the workbench, considering her words. "Guess I've made my share of messes." She didn't respond immediately, but after a beat she said, "I think you're trying to do better, and that counts for something." Roy was quiet for a long time, his eyes scanning the garage, the tools hanging neatly on the wall. "I'm not sure if doing better is enough anymore." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, stepping closer. "You don't think you're allowed to be better, to change?" "It's not that," he replied, his voice distant. "It's just that sometimes I think you can only go so far before the past catches up with you, and no matter how much you try to outrun it, it'll still find you." Sarah stood silently, taking in what he'd said. Then, without a word, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to him, her fingers brushing his briefly. "What's this?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. "Something for you to consider," she said. "I'm not saying it'll change everything, but I think it might give you some peace of mind." Roy unfolded the paper. At first, it seemed like an ordinary letter, a formal, typed note. But as he read, his eyes narrowed. The letter was from a lawyer, confirming that the department had been taking steps to address the incident with the SWAT team. There were promises of retraining, of implementing new procedures. It was clear the department was trying to put the issue to bed, but the last paragraph caught his eye. We would like to offer a formal apology for the actions of our officers. Further, we are requesting your assistance in assisting with a new initiative that seeks to address accountability in law enforcement. Your expertise, both in military and civilian engagement, could play a critical role in shaping this new training program. Roy crumpled the paper in his hand, feeling the heat of frustration rising in his chest. "I don't need their apology," he muttered. "I didn't think you did," Sarah said quietly. "But what about this? What about the chance to make a real change?" He threw the letter on the workbench, running a hand through his hair. "I've spent my whole life making changes for people who didn't ask for them, people who never understood the cost. Then maybe this time you can change things for the better," Sarah said. "Maybe this time you can do something that matters for the right reasons." Roy stared at the crumpled letter for a long time. He knew it would be easy to walk away from it, to leave it all behind. But something in Sarah's words, and in the silence that followed, made him pause. Maybe the world hadn't changed much, maybe it never would, but maybe that didn't mean he couldn't be a part of the change. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him. For the first time in months, he wasn't sure what the answer was, but he knew he couldn't let fear of the past dictate his future. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Sarah smiled faintly, her expression a mix of relief and understanding. "You don't have to decide right now, but I think you know what you need to do." Roy nodded, but his thoughts were already far away, tangled up in possibilities. The quiet had become a little less peaceful, the weight of his past threatening to tip the balance. But as he walked back into the house, the sound of Linda's laughter in the next room reminded him of something. No matter how complicated his past had been, there was still something worth fighting for. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to make it right. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the kitchen. Roy sat at the table, coffee in hand, watching the steam rise, lost in thought. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't rushing anywhere. There was no mission, no urgent calls, just the soft hum of life moving on. Linda was in the other room, humming quietly as she went about her morning routine. Sarah had left earlier, after a conversation that Roy still couldn't quite shake. She'd made him realize something he'd been avoiding for a long time. He was more than his past mistakes, more than the ghosts of battles he'd fought. Both, real and imagined. It was the quiet that unsettled him. He had lived in the noise for so long, the rush of orders, the chaos of combat, the pressure of being the man who always had to act, that now, in the silence, it was hard to know what to do with himself. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Roy stood, setting the coffee cup down and moving toward the front of the house. He opened the door to find a man standing on the porch, a middle-aged officer in a crisp uniform. "Roy Tanner?" The man's voice was steady, his posture rigid, almost too formal. "Yeah, that's me. What can I do for you?" The officer gave a brief nod, then pulled out a badge and held it up for Roy to see. "Detective Matthews, with the local precinct. I need to speak with you about the incident involving the SWAT team." Roy's stomach tightened at the mention of the event that had set everything in motion, the shooting, the chaos, the aftermath. He had hoped, after everything that had happened, that it was finally over. But here it was, standing on his doorstep. "Come on in," Roy said, stepping aside. He didn't invite the man to sit, but Matthews took a seat at the kitchen table anyway, folding his hands in front of him. "I won't take up much of your time," Matthews said. "I just need to confirm a few details about what happened during the operation. It's part of a review the department's conducting. You're probably aware of it." Roy leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "I'm aware. I don't think there's anything else to say about it." Matthews studied him for a moment before speaking again, this time with a touch more softness in his voice. "I know. You've been through a lot, Mr. Tanner, but there's something I think you need to hear." Roy raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" There are people in the department, higher-ups, who've been pushing to sweep this under the rug. But there are also people who believe you deserve more than just being a scapegoat. You've got supporters, people who want to make sure you're treated fairly in all this. They want you to be part of the reform, part of the solution. Roy's heart skipped a beat. The words didn't sink in right away. He wasn't sure what Matthews was trying to say, but it was clear he wasn't just here to conduct an interview. There was something else going on beneath the surface. "You've been through the ringer," Matthews continued. "But there's still a chance to make something out of all this. The department's looking to establish a program, training, accountability, better oversight. They want someone who understands both the military side and the law enforcement side to take a lead role in it." Roy looked down, his fingers brushing the edge of the counter. It felt like the universe was playing a cruel game. After everything, after all the destruction and pain, someone was offering him a chance to make a difference. The same people who had abandoned him in his darkest moments were now calling him in for help. He shook his head slowly, almost laughing, at the absurdity of it. "I'm not a cop, Matthews. I'm not here to fix the department. I'm just a guy who tried to make things right and ended up screwing everything up." Matthews's gaze softened. "I know you don't want to hear this, but that's exactly why they need you. You know what it's like to make tough decisions. You know what it costs. And you know what it means to take responsibility for your actions." Roy was quiet for a long time, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. The silence between them stretched out, almost too long. He could hear the sound of his own breath, steady but uncertain. "You don't have to make a decision right now," Matthews said, "but think about it. Think about the lives that could be changed, the things that could be different if you were part of this. You've got a chance, Roy, not just to redeem yourself, but to make things right, to leave something behind that's worth remembering." Roy exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing just a little. He'd spent so many years running from his past, trying to outrun the ghosts of his mistakes. But maybe, just maybe, he had a chance to face them head-on. Not to erase them, because they could never be erased, but to make something better from them. After a long pause, Roy nodded. "I'll think about it." Matthews stood up, tucking his badge back into his jacket pocket. "I'll leave you to it. Just know that the offer's there, Roy. And it's not just a favor to you. It's a favor to everyone who's still trying to fix this mess." Roy watched as Matthews left, the door clicking shut behind him. He stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where the detective had been, the silence thick around him. When Linda walked into the room, Roy turned to her, his face unreadable. "We've got some thinking to do." She raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" "The department's offering me a chance to be part of the reform program," he said, his voice steady. "I don't know if it'll work, but it might be the only shot I get at doing something that actually matters." Linda studied him for a long moment. "You don't have to do it, Roy. I just want you to be happy, to be here." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the window. The sun had risen higher now, the morning light brightening the room. The world was still turning, even though it felt like everything had stopped. "Maybe," Roy said. "Maybe it's time to leave something behind that's worth remembering."